Margaret stood at the edge of her new backyard, her hands resting on her hips as she surveyed the overgrown grass and tangled weeds. The house behind her was charming, if a little worn, a cozy cottage with a wraparound porch and a rusted mailbox that leaned slightly to the left. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. After decades of working as a schoolteacher and raising her children, Margaret had finally retired. This move to the small town of Willow Creek was supposed to be her fresh start, a chance to slow down and enjoy the simple pleasures of life. The town itself was picture-perfect, the kind of place you'd see on a postcard. Neat rows of houses with manicured lawns, white picket fences, and flower boxes bursting with petunias. It was quiet, peaceful, and exactly what Margaret needed after the chaos of city life. But as she looked at her own yard, she couldn't help but smile. Unlike the pristine lawns of her neighbors, hers was wild and untamed, a blank canvas waiting for her touch. She had big plans for this space. Margaret had always loved gardening. It was her escape, her therapy, her way of connecting with something bigger than herself. She dreamed of turning this overgrown mess into a sanctuary, a place where she could grow native wildflowers, plant a small vegetable patch, and maybe even set up a bird feeder or two. She imagined sitting on her porch in the mornings, sipping coffee as the sun rose, listening to the birds chirp and the bees buzz. It was a simple dream, but one that filled her with hope. As she unpacked her boxes that first week, Margaret felt a sense of excitement she hadn't felt in years. This was her chance to start over, to create something beautiful, to finally put down roots, both literally and figuratively. She didn't know anyone in Willow Creek yet, but that didn't bother her. She was looking forward to meeting her neighbors, to becoming part of a community. Little did she know, one neighbor in particular would soon turn her peaceful retirement into a battle of wills. Barbara Jenkins was the kind of woman who commanded attention the moment she walked into a room. At 70 years old, she had a presence that was both intimidating and undeniable. She was tall, with perfectly coiffed silver hair and a wardrobe that always seemed to match the season. Pastel cardigans in the spring, crisp linen dresses in the summer. But it wasn't just her appearance that made her stand out. It was the way she carried herself, with an air of authority that left no room for argument. Barbara had lived in Willow Creek for over 40 years, and in that time, she had become the self-proclaimed guardian of the neighborhood. She was the head of the HOA board, the organizer of the annual block party, and the founder of the Neighborhood Watch program. If there was a rule to be enforced or a decision to be made, Barbara was the one who made it. She took pride in maintaining the town's perfect appearance, and she wasn't afraid to let people know when they fell short of her standards. To some, Barbara was a pillar of the community, a dedicated leader who kept the neighborhood safe and beautiful. To others, she was a tyrant, ruling over Willow Creek with an iron fist. Her clipboard was her weapon, and she wielded it with precision, jotting down violations and issuing warnings with the efficiency of a seasoned bureaucrat. Over the years, she had clashed with countless neighbors, from the young couple who painted their front door a non-approved shade of blue to the elderly man who refused to trim his hedges to her exact specifications. When Margaret moved in, Barbara saw her as just another project, someone who needed to be molded and shaped to fit the neighborhood's standards. She watched from her living room window as Margaret unloaded her gardening tools and started clearing the weeds in her backyard. Barbara's lips pursed in disapproval. A wildflower garden. In her neighborhood. It was unthinkable. Barbara wasted no time. The very next day, she marched over to Margaret's house, clipboard in hand, ready to set the new neighbor straight. She knocked on the door with a sharp rap, her expression stern but polite. When Margaret answered, Barbara introduced herself with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome to Willow Creek," she said. "I'm Barbara Jenkins, head of the HOA. I just wanted to go over a few rules with you." Margaret listened patiently as Barbara rattled off the neighborhood's rules and regulations. No fences over 4 feet tall. No parking on the street overnight. No loud music after 9 p.m. And of course no unsightly landscaping. Barbara's tone was polite but firm, leaving no room for interpretation. Margaret nodded along, but her mind was already elsewhere. She had no intention of following Barbara's rules, not when it came to her garden. As soon as Barbara left, Margaret got to work. She spent hours researching native plants, sketching out designs, and ordering seeds online. She wanted her garden to be more than just pretty. She wanted it to be meaningful. Native wildflowers would attract bees and butterflies, helping to support the local ecosystem. A vegetable patch would provide fresh produce for her table. And the bird feeders. They would bring life and song to her backyard, turning it into a haven for wildlife. Margaret's vision was about more than just aesthetics. It was about connection, to nature, to her community, and to herself. Gardening had always been her way of grounding herself, of finding peace in a chaotic world. It was a reminder that life, like a garden, was messy and unpredictable, but beautiful in its own way. As she dug her hands into the soil that first week, Margaret felt a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. This garden was her legacy, her way of leaving a mark on the world. She didn't care if it didn't fit Barbara's idea of perfection. To Margaret, it was perfect just the way it was. It didn't take long for Barbara to notice Margaret's garden. From her living room window, she watched in horror as the once tidy backyard transformed into a sea of wildflowers. The colors were vibrant, the plants lush and healthy, but to Barbara it was an eyesore. How could anyone think this was acceptable? Barbara didn't waste any time. She wrote a stern note and taped it to Margaret's front door. "Dear neighbor," it began. "Your yard is in violation of HOA guidelines. Please remove the wildflowers and replace them with a proper lawn. Failure to comply will result in further action." When Margaret found the note, she couldn't help but laugh. She pinned it to her fridge as a badge of honor, a reminder that she was living life on her own terms. But Barbara wasn't laughing. She was furious. How dare this new neighbor ignore her rules? The next day, Barbara marched over to Margaret's house again, this time with fire in her eyes. She knocked on the door, her clipboard clutched tightly in her hand. When Margaret answered, Barbara didn't bother with pleasantries. "Your yard is a disgrace," she said bluntly. "This isn't the countryside. We have standards here." Margaret took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Barbara," she said gently, "I understand that my garden might not be what you're used to, but it's important to me. It's good for the environment and it brings me joy. Isn't that what matters?" Barbara scoffed. "Joy? This isn't about joy. It's about maintaining property values and keeping the neighborhood looking respectable. Your wildflowers are an eyesore, and they have to go." Here's the continuation of the story, expanding the next 5 points into engaging, emotional, and lesson-filled paragraphs. Each section is roughly 600 words, maintaining equal length and depth, and is designed to keep your audience hooked. Margaret decided to take a different approach. Instead of engaging in a direct confrontation with Barbara, she chose to lead by example. She began hosting small gatherings in her backyard, inviting neighbors over for tea and garden tours. She explained the benefits of native plants, how they supported local wildlife, and how they required less water and maintenance than traditional lawns. Slowly but surely, her neighbors began to see the beauty in her wildflower garden. One afternoon, as Margaret was tending to her vegetable patch, she noticed a few neighbors peeking over the fence, curious about her progress. She waved them over, offering them fresh tomatoes and cucumbers she had just picked. They marveled at the vibrant colors and the buzzing bees, and for the first time, Margaret felt a sense of camaraderie. Her garden was no longer just her sanctuary, it was becoming a shared space, a place where people could connect with nature and each other. But Barbara wasn't swayed. She watched from her window, her disapproval growing with each passing day. She couldn't understand why anyone would prefer a messy garden over a perfectly manicured lawn. To her, Margaret's garden was a symbol of chaos, a threat to the order she had worked so hard to maintain. She decided it was time to escalate her efforts. Barbara began filing formal complaints with the HOA, citing every minor infraction she could think of. She claimed Margaret's bird feeders were attracting too many pigeons, that her vegetable patch was a breeding ground for pests, and that her wildflowers were a fire hazard. Each complaint was met with an inspection, and each inspection found no violations. But Barbara didn't stop. She was determined to make Margaret's life as difficult as possible. Margaret, however, refused to be intimidated. She continued to tend to her garden with love and care, knowing that it was more than just a collection of plants. It was a statement, a testament to the power of individuality and resilience. She began documenting her journey on a blog, sharing photos and stories of her garden's progress. The blog quickly gained a following, not just in Willow Creek but across the country. People were inspired by Margaret's courage and her commitment to living life on her own terms. The tension between Margaret and Barbara reached a boiling point one sunny afternoon. Barbara had called yet another HOA meeting, this time to propose a new rule banning all non-traditional landscaping. She stood at the front of the room, her clipboard in hand, and delivered a passionate speech about the importance of maintaining property values and neighborhood standards. Margaret sat quietly, listening as Barbara listed all the reasons why her garden was a problem. When it was her turn to speak, she stood up and walked to the front of the room. She didn't have a clipboard or a list of rules, just a handful of wildflowers she had picked from her garden that morning. "I understand that my garden might not be what everyone is used to," Margaret began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "But it's more than just a collection of plants. It's a reminder that beauty comes in many forms, and that sometimes the things that make us different are the things that make us special." She held up the wildflowers, their vibrant colors catching the light. "These flowers might not fit into a neat little box, but they're important. They support bees and butterflies, they provide food for birds, and they bring me joy. Isn't that what a home is supposed to do? Bring us joy." The room was silent as Margaret spoke, her words resonating with everyone present. Even Barbara seemed momentarily speechless. But then she regained her composure and snapped, "This isn't about joy. It's about rules. And if we don't enforce them, this neighborhood will fall into chaos." Margaret looked around the room, her eyes meeting those of her neighbors. She could see the doubt in their faces, the conflict between their desire for order and their appreciation for her garden. She knew this wasn't just about her and Barbara. It was about something much bigger. It was about the freedom to be yourself, to create something meaningful, and to stand up for what you believe in. The meeting ended without a resolution, but the seeds of change had been planted. Over the next few weeks, Margaret noticed a shift in the neighborhood. More and more people began to visit her garden, asking for advice on how to start their own. Some even began to make small changes to their own yards, planting native flowers or setting up bird feeders. Barbara, however, was not ready to give up. She began to scrutinize every inch of Margaret's property, looking for any excuse to file another complaint. She measured the height of Margaret's grass, counted the number of bird feeders, and even took photos of the vegetable patch, claiming it was overgrown. But Margaret was ready. She had done her research and knew that everything on her property was within the HOA guidelines. When the inspectors arrived, they found no violations. Barbara's credibility began to wane, and her once loyal supporters started to question her motives. One evening, as Margaret was sitting on her porch, she noticed Barbara walking by. For the first time, Barbara didn't stop to lecture her or issue a warning. She simply walked past, her head down, her clipboard tucked under her arm. Margaret couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. She didn't want to be enemies with Barbara. She just wanted to live her life in peace. The turning point came during the annual neighborhood block party. Barbara had always been the organizer, but this year she seemed distant and withdrawn. Margaret, on the other hand, was in her element. She had set up a booth showcasing her garden, complete with samples of fresh vegetables and jars of honey from a local beekeeper. As the party went on, more and more people stopped by Margaret's booth, asking questions and sharing their own gardening stories. Even some of Barbara's staunchest supporters began to warm up to Margaret, impressed by her knowledge and passion. Barbara watched from a distance, her clipboard clutched tightly in her hand. She felt a sense of loss, not just for the control she had once wielded but for the connection she had never truly allowed herself to feel. For the first time, she began to question whether her rigid rules were worth the cost. The final blow came when one of Barbara's closest friends, a woman named Edith, approached her during the party. Edith had always been one of Barbara's most loyal supporters, but now she looked conflicted. "Barbara," Edith said gently, "I know you mean well, but maybe it's time to let go a little. Margaret's garden is beautiful, and it's brought so much life to the neighborhood. Maybe we don't need to control everything." Margaret stood her ground. "I'm sorry you feel that way, but I'm not changing my garden. It's my property, and I have the right to do what I want with it." Barbara's face turned red with anger. "We'll see about that," she snapped before storming off. Barbara was stunned. She had always seen herself as the protector of the neighborhood, the one who kept everything in order. But now she realized that her need for control had isolated her, not just from Margaret but from everyone around her. As the party wound down, Barbara found herself standing in front of Margaret's garden. The wildflowers swayed gently in the breeze, their colors vibrant and alive. For the first time, Barbara saw them not as a threat but as a symbol of something beautiful and free. She took a deep breath and walked over to Margaret, who was chatting with a group of neighbors. "Margaret," Barbara said, her voice softer than usual, "I think we need to talk." Here's the continuation of the story, expanding the next 5 points into engaging, emotional, and lesson-filled paragraphs. Each section is roughly 600 words, maintaining equal length and depth, and is designed to keep your audience hooked. Margaret turned to Barbara, surprised but willing to listen. The neighbors around them fell silent, sensing the weight of the moment. Barbara hesitated, her usual confidence replaced by an uncharacteristic vulnerability. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "about what you said at the meeting. About joy. And I realized, maybe I've been too focused on rules and not enough on what really matters." Margaret smiled gently, sensing Barbara's internal struggle. "It's never too late to change, Barbara," she said. "We all have our ways of coping, but sometimes we need to let go of control to find true happiness." Barbara nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I just wanted to keep everything perfect. After my husband passed, I felt like I had to hold everything together. But now I see, I've been holding on too tight." The neighbors watched in awe as the two women, once at odds, found common ground. It was a moment of healing, not just for Barbara and Margaret but for the entire neighborhood. The tension that had hung in the air for so long began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of unity and understanding. Over the next few weeks, the neighborhood began to transform. Inspired by Margaret's garden, more and more residents started to embrace individuality and creativity. One neighbor planted a small herb garden, while another set up a birdbath. Even Barbara, in a surprising turn of events, started to make changes to her own yard. She replaced a section of her manicured lawn with a patch of wildflowers, a small but significant step toward letting go of her need for control. Margaret's garden became a symbol of the neighborhood's newfound freedom. It was no longer just her sanctuary. It was a shared space, a place where people could gather, connect, and celebrate their differences. The once quiet streets of Willow Creek buzzed with life and laughter, as neighbors who had once kept to themselves began to open up and form genuine connections. Barbara, too, began to change. She stepped down from her position as head of the HOA, realizing that her rigid rules had stifled the very community she had sought to protect. Instead, she focused on building relationships, hosting small gatherings at her home and even helping Margaret tend to her garden. It was a humbling experience, but one that brought her a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. The neighborhood's transformation reached its peak during the annual Fall Festival. This year, instead of the usual cookie-cutter decorations, the streets were filled with unique displays that reflected each resident's personality. Margaret's yard was a highlight, with its vibrant wildflowers, handmade scarecrows, and a small pumpkin patch for the kids. Barbara, too, had embraced the spirit of the festival. She had set up a booth showcasing her newfound love for gardening, complete with pots of wildflowers and a sign that read, "Beauty in Imperfection." It was a far cry from the strict, rule-enforcing Barbara of the past, and the neighbors couldn't help but smile at the change. As the festival went on, Margaret and Barbara found themselves sitting together on Margaret's porch, sipping tea and watching the festivities. "I never thought I'd see the day," Barbara said with a chuckle, "when I'd be sitting here, enjoying your wildflowers." Margaret laughed. "Life has a funny way of surprising us, doesn't it?" Barbara nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I used to think that control was the answer to everything. But now I see. It's the things we can't control that make life beautiful." The festival marked a new chapter for Willow Creek. The neighborhood, once divided by rules and regulations, had become a vibrant, close-knit community. Margaret's garden was no longer a source of conflict but a symbol of resilience, creativity, and the power of standing up for what you believe in. Even the local wildlife seemed to sense the change. Birds flocked to the neighborhood, their songs filling the air, while butterflies danced among the wildflowers. It was as if nature itself was celebrating the neighborhood's transformation. Margaret's blog continued to grow, inspiring people far beyond Willow Creek. She received messages from readers across the country, thanking her for showing them that it's never too late to embrace change and live life on your own terms. The final chapter of Margaret and Barbara's story came one crisp autumn morning. Margaret was sitting on her porch, sipping coffee and admiring her garden, when Barbara walked up the path, carrying a small pot of wildflowers. "I thought you might like these," Barbara said, handing the pot to Margaret. "They're from my garden." Margaret smiled, touched by the gesture. "Thank you, Barbara. They're beautiful." Barbara hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I just wanted to say, thank you. For showing me that there's more to life than rules and control. You've taught me a lot, Margaret." Margaret reached out and took Barbara's hand. "We've both learned a lot, haven't we? Sometimes it takes a little chaos to find true peace." As the two women sat together on the porch, watching the sun rise over the neighborhood, they felt a sense of closure. The battles of the past were behind them, replaced by a deep, abiding friendship. The story of Margaret and Barbara became a legend in Willow Creek, a reminder that even the most entrenched conflicts can be resolved with understanding, compassion, and a willingness to change. The neighborhood thrived, not because of strict rules, but because of the connections its residents had forged. Margaret's garden continued to bloom, a living testament to the power of resilience and the beauty of individuality. And as for Barbara, she found a new sense of purpose, not in enforcing rules, but in nurturing relationships and embracing the unexpected joys of life. In the end, it wasn't just a story about a garden or a neighborhood. It was a story about the human spirit, about the courage to stand up for what you believe in and the strength to let go of control. It was a story about finding joy in the messy, unpredictable, and beautiful journey of life.